Wuthering Waves is just a few days out, and there has been a lot of conversation going around the game because everybody is extremely excited for it. Now, just the other week, I Am Ravenous did a very interesting video topic that I wanted to actually put my 2 cents on, and I think there was some discussion going about it on Twitter as well. And he brought up a very good point, or at least a very good topic to start off that I think got the community stirred up a bit, which stating that Yinlin is not a sub DPS. Now, this video actually goes into even more depth, not only Yinlin, but going over the whole definition and terms we're going to be using for characters and stuff, and how to describe their role within Wuthering Waves. And I think it's a good discussion to bring up because it makes us think more about how the game could be further developed. I think this would essentially translate or shift the game into a perspective of how we would think depending on what things that we will classify as our roles within Wuthering Waves. It'll just essentially define how the game will be played. But enough of me talking, let's get into what Ravenous actually brought up within this video and provide our thoughts on it.
I know this is a controversial topic and I have a hot take here, and since many have either outright dismissed my take or asked for an explanation, here we go. So let's talk about it. I want to give you my perspective on why I think Yinlin is actually not a sub DPS. And I invite you
let's
to
hear what he got to say
with me in the comments.
Yeah, let's discuss
Feel free to
it.
listen to this video in the background. There won't really be much shown on the screen. Also, I do expect you to already have a rough idea on what Yinlin does. That said, here's why. Traditional categories like main DPS, sub DPS, and support will actually not work for Wuthering Waves. At least for now, we don't really know what the...
That right there is already a bold statement to say, because the term DPS, sub DPS, and support is already something that is used in a lot of RPGs, whether it be single player or multiplayer. Those are things that are used to describe different class types. And if you don't necessarily know what those words are or what they mean, a DPS, which is acronym for damage per second, tends to represent characters that are heavily prioritized or focused on being heavy damage dealers within whatever game they're in. Sub DPS are DPS as well that focus on damage, but they also have a role of buffing the other DPS within their team. They have essentially two roles that they play. Another thing that brings up what a sub DPS is, or kind of what people insinuated what it means, is that people kind of categorize it as the weaker DPS within the role, which is the angle I think that Ravenous is going to be aiming towards here, which probably makes him why he think Yinlin doesn't fit that category of role, which I think is a good discussion to bring about. And a support can vary in many different games of what they do, but a support can be a buffer, they can be a healer, any character that essentially enhances the overall team by providing buffs, healing, any of those sorts in order to improve their overall team. That is what a support character does. Their goal is to support the team.
Future brings. But I will get back to that. Let's first take an example. Let's say we have a team built of Kuro, Yinlin, and Verena.
Okay, the main team comp that everybody brings up.
Doing 300,000 damage within 20 seconds, and Yinlin is doing 200,000 damage, but only needs 10 seconds.
Okay.
We will ignore Verena for now. In that scenario, Kuro would do more damage than Yinlin, but takes also significantly longer. This means, for this specific example, that Yinlin actually has higher DPS than Kuro.
That is true.
Just going by the term main DPS, which unit would now be our main DPS? The one dealing more damage or the one dealing more, well, DPS?
And that's exactly where I figured he was going with. So in case you might be confusing, well, if Kuro is dealing more damage, why isn't he the main DPS? It's because, again, DPS is the acronym for damage per second. It's about who can spit out the most damage the fastest. So Kuro can have a higher potential cap or max of how much damage he could do, but if Yinlin can produce a high amount of damage faster than him within, say, a time constraint, then she by definition would be the main DPS, because he's going off of the idea of that a sub DPS would be the weaker DPS within this description, which I have had a discussion with other creators and stuff, and a lot of people don't agree with that description of what a sub DPS is, but it is somewhat tied to it in a sense for other RPGs. I think that's a good point to bring up, and I'm glad we're having this discussion because of this.
Main DPS of any team will always be either the one dealing the most damage or the one dealing the highest DPS, whereas personally I prefer to measure by the latter. Next, let's have a look at Yinlin's kit. We will start with her inherent skill, Deadly Focus. The damage of Resonant Skill Lightning Execution is increased by 10% when hitting targets marked with Sinner's Mark, and Yinlin's attack is increased by 10% for 4 seconds when this is triggered.
Yeah, okay,
this passive literally requires Yinlin to stay on field and use her full basic attack combo in the matter of skill, 4 times basic, and skill again, to actually make good usage of this. And during the skill window, her skill reads the following. Basic attack and dodge counter will trigger 1 magnetic blast when hitting a target. My point here being, she is clearly designed to be used as an on-field DPS character. Yes, sure, she also has some off-field damage capabilities, and as well as her outro skill, which buffs the next character. But do you know who else does? Danjin. So is Danjin now a sub DPS because she buffs the next character?
That's true.
Many would probably argue no.
That's true.
I hope you understand the point I'm trying to get across here.
Yeah. So a big thing that everybody talks about with Danjin is her damage output because of her whole gimmick of being able to sacrifice her health to output more damage. Nobody really talks about Danjin being a sub DPS a lot of times. They always tend to speak about her in a main DPS role. But she has a similar skill like Yinlin, where she does provide a buff to the other DPS unit within the team when you switch out of her. Ultimately, what that kind of brings me to is that I think maybe the term sub DPS is fine, but I think maybe the overall better thing to kind of come up, or maybe we have like a new terminology, or maybe not new, maybe like a reconstructed version of the terminology I'm about to use, which is a flex DPS. Flex DPS is something more so I've seen in Overwatch, and my definition for such as Wuthering Waves, I would say we could have a flex DPS where they could play 2 other roles. They could be a direct buffer and supporter of the team, while still performing on field and off field due to whatever type of buffs that they have. But they also have the capability of being a main DPS and having other units support them. Now, once you have these certain characters that mark these certain parameters, then that's when the overall conversation or change in how we think about it will truly matter. Because at the moment, we only have a certain odd amount of units as the game is just about to come out, so we don't really have characters that will really force us to fluctuate or change the way of our thinking, essentially, which is why I think Revenants is getting to. We don't have the game yet, and we only have but so many ways we can play the characters currently. But once we get more units, there could be a unit similar to Yinlin, and they could have really good synergy with one another and be able to swap back and forth with each other, because of like maybe they have like a twin electro synergy where you constantly swap in between them, you constantly buff them. And then that becomes more of a discussion of, like I said, well, how do you determine which one is the main DPS or sub DPS if they support one another? Like so right now, the characters that we have, like Karcharo, he's more of a selfish DPS. He doesn't care about supporting his team. He's designed that you build a team around him to support him. But if we have other units that are similar to Yinlin that can be built to support your team and be direct damage dealers, then we can have a discussion about not essentially labeling those direct roles to a specific character, which is kind of my whole take on it. Is that, which I know we still have a good much of the video to go through, but my whole point of it, or like my whole take on it, is that we can have these labels or roles for characters, but don't let them be the cemented thing that they only represent. Because down the line, like I said, Yinlin can be just a sub DPS at the moment, but there could be units down the line that allows her to shift and be in a more flexible role than just being a sub DPS, which I think the term flex DPS could be a great thing to pick up within the community.
Calchado and Yinlin work fantastic together, but that is exactly it. They are great together. That does not necessarily mean either of them is a sub or main DPS. Both of them are just DPS, and whoever does the most damage will highly depend on the rotation used, the character's individual equipment, their levels, enemy resistances, and, well, how you as a player can play them. Try playing Danjin but get hit by literally anything. Your DPS won't be great if you are dead. So let's briefly talk about why Calchado and Yinlin work fantastic together. You know, this one resource, concerto energy.
Oh, I feel yeah, Rivenus, if you're looking for a person that be doing a lot of stats and digging up, definitely check out his content. He's been doing a lot of the number crunching and stuff within the community so far.
Means he wants liberation energy. So, as you can see here, one full rotation with Yinlin only brings her up to around 50 concerto, which means she needs 2 of these rotations, and her skill has a 12-second cooldown. This means what you want to do is start with Yinlin, generate half her concerto bar, switch to Calchado, do his basic skill, basic skill, basic skill, basic heavy attack combo, go back to Yinlin, do the second part of Yinlin's combo, and then you can finally switch into Calchado and activate Yinlin's outro to actually start his ultimate rotation. And that brings me back to the first point I made.
Before he says anything about that, I believe he brings that up to talk about the whole on and off field situation, because one of the things tied to a sub DPS is that they are characters that have their own DPS value by not only doing damage but supporting the primary DPS off field, whether that be buffing their damage or having something that can be triggered by other characters on field because they left something behind. And I believe, like Yinlin's case, she leaves a mark on the enemy, and it can be triggered by other electro units, if I'm not mistaken, which is one of her primary buffer elements, if I'm not mistaken. She also has an outro skill that buffs electro damage as well. And so he brings up the fact that Yinlin has two on-field rotations she needs to do, because in order for her to apply her off-field damage buff and her support for other characters, she has to remain on field. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't take away the fact that she's a sub DPS, because she still has that off-field element about her, which fills that sub DPS role. It's just that for sub DPSs within, or like sub roles within Wuthering Waves, it's going to play a bit different than other games, because fundamentally the game wants characters to be on field more than off field, if not outside of arena, which overall I think makes the game a lot more exciting and a lot more not more fast paced, but a lot more engaging to watch and consume, because it's cool to have a unit that's really strong and doesn't have to do anything. They're just on the team and they support the team. But at what cost of that bring is that it sacrifices enjoyment out of that unit, because if the strength of that unit is to not play them, then personally for me, even though they're strong and broken, I don't really care to pull for that. I buy a unit in order for the reason, or I grind or pull for a unit for the fact of being able to play them because they look cool and I like them and I want them to be my primary focus. It just kind of takes away the wildness of the characters. Like, dang, if this is the pinnacle of the character and the peak of them and how strong they truly are is to just do a quick trigger and not play them, that kind of sucks. That's kind of boring.
Traditional categories like main DPS, sub DPS and support will not work for Wuthering Waves. That is what I said in the beginning of the video.
It's just a bold take.
Waves is inherently
I don't completely agree with that, but I can understand what he's going with.
However, some characters like Calchado require to stay on field for 11 seconds during his ultimate to actually get the most damage out of this. And most DPS based characters have quite long rotations, while the enemies are very aggressive and active, which require you to dodge and parry basically constantly. This inherently makes it basically impossible for you to always do perfect rotations. It really is just a question of how early and when into any combo you can swap without it fizzling.
That's another good point. This game is going to be a lot more aggressive than a lot of gacha games, especially when you get to the higher level content of the game. And Tectone brought up in one of his videos recently is that the thing that breeds difficulty in these type of games is not difficulty through using the character unit, is the difficulty through the bosses, the enemies forcing you to change up your attack patterns. Once you get set into a flow or a rotation of doing a certain pattern, regardless of how intuitive it can be, once you get used to that pattern, it becomes a cakewalk. It could be a long chain of numbers in a random assortment. If that assortment doesn't get changed, or if the game doesn't force you to change, it doesn't breed any like true form of difficulty once you get that pattern down. And the cool thing about Wuthering Waves is that the bosses and the enemies, they will fight you in a way that forces you to change that. And so that, like Riven said, there's going to be instances where you won't be able to get a perfect rotation, that you won't be able to get the max damage value out of it. So there's going to be cases where like Cháo comes out on the field in comparison to Yinlin, he might lose out and sacrifice DPS because the enemies, the bosses that you're fighting might prevent him from really stealing the show. And that's really important because, again, what is Yinlin's job? Her main job is to be out on point first, build up her gauge halfway, bring in Cháo, then switch, Cháo switches back out from her to build her back up, to then finally give Cháo his main DPS phase with his ultimate. In order to build up to that part and finally get to that moment, and then if Cháo can't do his full DPS sequence once his turn comes back around, that's going to overall sacrifice his overall DPS value if he isn't able to complete his full DPS rotation, which in context, in vein of talking about overall damage per second, not using it as a noun and like a role for the character, but just the acronym DPS per second, in that stance, Yinlin would more than likely be the main DPS in that case.
If you combine all of this together, we cannot really follow the standard approach of main DPS, sub DPS, and support.
Yeah, I agree. You can't follow the main way.
Maybe we can go as far as DPS debuffer and support, or DPS hybrid and support. Whereas the support is a buffer.
I like hybrid. I think terms like hybrid, flex, anything of the sort that essentially means that they can play or they can fulfill multiple roles, I think that is going to be the better terminology to use for the game.
So a few of those might ask now why I have included sub DPS in my beginner's guide. And that's a fair question. The answer is honestly simple. Everyone right now who talks about Wuthering Waves talks about it with exactly those terms. Anybody who looks up guides will see the terms main DPS, sub DPS, and support, at least right now. And in my opinion, it is important that those people who watch these guides don't get fed vastly different information from various creators, otherwise they will just be left confused. In hindsight, maybe I should have avoided these terms, but I honestly don't know. In the end, we will have to wait until...
I agree. I think he did the right call of still using the terminology that everybody is used to, because again, even though this video for Revenants did pretty well, this is still pretty much an outlier perspective, or a very outlier-ish opinion that the community hasn't revolved around yet. So for Revenant's case, he's essentially saying that he didn't want to go against what the community was saying with like the road main DPS, sub DPS, and support, because the large majority was using this terminology in the contents that they were making and the discussions that they were having. So to have the platform that he has now and to kind of shift that topic without even describing his point of view like he is now, it would have caused people more confusion, because it would have been like, oh well, you said that she's this type of DPS, but everybody else is saying this. Well, why are you saying that? Because now that just confuses me, and it'll kind of go into a element like that, which understandable. But I am glad that he did this video, because it brings a bigger light and a bigger discussion on how we should move forward once the game is kind of settled after the first few weeks or the first month or two of the game. I think that's when we'll be able to more specifically talk about things like character roles, the roles that they play, what descriptions and terms that we should use for characters, and how they overall fundamentally work in the game. Because right now, everything that we know about Wuthering Waves is based off of beta information, and this is for information that's going to be changing on release day, because characters have gotten changed. We're going to be able to probably formulate different opinions on characters' overall strengths and the roles and stuff that they provide, which will be able to properly determine the proper roles that they'll be able to play. Like he said earlier, we describe Donjin as a main DPS, but we mostly do that because everybody has been talking about her from a solo perspective. They haven't really talked about her in an overall team composition because her overall DPS value comes from her being selfish and prioritizing being on the field, because she's playing that glass cannon playstyle, which glass cannon just means you have a very low HP but you spit out large amount of damage. But in an overall team composition, because she won't be able to do that whole on field selfishness unless she's running something like a character like Verena, she's going to have to swap out and sacrifice her own DPS in order to provide other characters on field rotation time.
Influential sites like Pridwin will establish some common terms so everyone can be on the same page. What these terms actually are doesn't matter as long as all have a common understanding of it. To conclude this, whatever terms we decide for, even if we go for main DPS and sub DPS, who exactly will be your main DPS will always depend on your team. And by that I mean your team specifically, not that one in the guide with perfect substats and equipment. I hope I made my point clear. Feel free to comment on it. Actually, I invite you to, and please share your perspective. Join the Discord and also let's have a discussion over there. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.
But that was a very good video on Rivenous. I will definitely be leaving it in the comments and in the description below. Definitely check out Rivenous channel. He has been doing a lot of amazing content for coming up with Wuthering Waves. And I just love videos like this that brings up a great discussion point for everybody to talk about. I think, again, the whole main DPS, sub DPS support thing is fine. Those are very basic and generic rules everybody mostly describes characters in a lot of single player and multiplayer games. I'm not surprised that the community has went towards those terminology because it's just the easiest thing to do. But does it properly convey the roles or how all these characters can be played within Wuthering Waves? That's something we'll have to find out and see. I'm on the boat that we probably should implement some other terminologies like hybrid or flex DPS, or hybrid and flex in general for anything like a buffer or support, because it'll allow us to properly convey to people what these characters actually are doing, instead of just giving them a role that just kind of fits what it is just because that's all the terms that we have. But hopefully this video was informative on my end and give you guys a better understanding of what Rivenous is coming from, as well as giving you a full circle on the overall conversation. But overall, that is everything that we have for the video. I appreciate you guys and all your love and support. Remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new. If you want to see more Wuthering Waves content as well as Zenless Zone Zero, I'm going to be covering both games on the channel. So if you guys want to see content on either one of those games or both of them, be sure to support your boy. Thank you for all the love, and remember to always believe in you that believes in yourself. I'll see you guys in the next one.